Let's open your hymnals to 555. I want that mountain, I want that mountain. We sang this last week. We're just going to sing one stanza of this, but I like that pioneering spirit of faith. 555, I want that mountain. Yeah, 555. I saw the giant of prayerlessness upon the mountain high. He laughed so hard at my unbended knee. No longer in the wilderness I'll stay, and so I'll cry. I want that mountain, it belongs to me. I want that mountain, I want that mountain, where the milk and honey flow, where the grapes of Esco grow. I want that mountain, I want that mountain, the mountain that my Lord has given me. 557, so send I you. So this talks about some of the challenges of being sent out in serving the Lord. And 557, so think about some of those challenges. So send I you to labor unrewarded, to serve unpaid, unloved, unsought, unknown, to bear rebuke, to suffer scorn and scoffing. So send I you to toil for me alone. Verse 2. So send I you to bind the bruised and broken, or wandering souls, to work, to weep, to wake, to bear the burdens of a world aweary. So send I you to suffer for my sake. So send I you to loneliness and longing, with heart a-hungering for the loved unknown, forsaking home and kindred, friend and dear one. So send I you to know my love alone. So send I you to leave your life's ambition, to die to dear desire, self-will, design, to labor long and love where men revile you. So send I you to lose your life in mine. So send I you to hearts made hard by hatred, to eyes made blind because they will not see, to spend the wheat, be blood to spend and spare not. So send I you to taste of Calvary. As the Father has sent me, so send I you. It's a thought-provoking song, and can be a little bit discouraging maybe in the sense, but also it's important to know that the Christian life does have its challenges, and yet the Lord was sent to suffer just as we are as well. Right across the page, 555, ready to suffer, grief, or pain, similar theme on these two songs. 558. Ready to suffer, grief, or pain, ready to stand the test, ready to stay at home and send others if he sees best, ready to go, ready to stay, ready my place to fill, ready for service, lowly or great, ready to do his will. Verse 4 on the last. Ready to speak, ready to warn, ready your souls to yearn, ready in life or ready in death, ready for his return. His will. Good singing. You can set your hymnal aside there. Some sobering songs to consider and to think about here this evening. Let's go to Zechariah. The book of Zechariah here tonight. In the Old Testament, if it's easier for you, find Matthew in the New Testament and then backpedal past Malachi to Zechariah. Zechariah, and we're in chapter number 1. Zechariah chapter number 1 here tonight. We're going to be looking at the last 4 verses of the chapter, and so I hope that you'll turn there. Zechariah chapter 1, verses 18 through 21, and I'm going to read those now. It says, "Then lifted I up mine eyes, and saw, and behold, 4 horns. And I said unto the angel that talked with me, What be these? And he answered me, These are the horns which have scattered Judah, Israel, and Jerusalem. And the Lord showed me 4 carpenters. Then said I, What come these to do? And he spake, saying, These are the horns which have scattered Judah, so that no man did lift up his head. But these are come to fray them, to cast out the horns of the Gentiles, which lifted up their horn over the land of Judah, to scatter it." The title of our message tonight is Behold, God Judges. We come now to the second of 8 visions that God gives to Zechariah that he wants the children of Israel, the Jewish people, to see. And these are our 8 truths that we need to see if we want to have hope in hard times, the title of our series. And so we've read through this particular vision, and as we see it and study it tonight, we're going to learn some truths to help us understand, something to encourage us in the hard times of life, that God judges. If you're familiar with hunting, I'm not necessarily the expert, so I'll do my best to try to be accurate. If you're familiar with hunting and you go to somebody's home that's a hunter, and you walk in and you're going to see something to show off their hunting prowess and skills. And particularly they're interested in hunting deer, and they enjoy being a deer hunter. What is it that you are going to see in their home if they're an avid deer hunter besides a gun? What might they hang up in order to show off their hunting skills in the field of hunting deer? An animal head, yes. You're going to see that. And many times the head that is there, in fact, most of the time, the goal is to have a head that has a rack on it. The bigger the rack, the bigger the antlers, the better off it is. In fact, there are times even in which men will mount the antlers without the head. And sometimes you'll see the antlers, you might see 2 of the paws sticking up like this, but most of the time, if they're going to put up something to show it off, they're going to put up the antlers. Not necessarily the tail, the ribs, the side, the knees, whatever. They're going to put up the antlers. Think about Western life. Cowboys and horses and cattle and some big ranch house somewhere, and you walk into this big Western ranch house and you're looking around and they've kind of got the rustic Western decor there, and you walk into the large family room, the living room there of the family, and there they have the fireplace and the mantle. What might you see above the fireplace of a large ranch home? If they're going to be talking about cattle and they're involved in the cattle industry, I suppose there could be a large hide up there, but many times you think about seeing a large set of longhorns over there. If someone wants to picture that ranching life, some huge, great big set of horns. You consider the safari or the jungle. And here you have in the jungle, you have the lion, the king of the beast, and he's got all this massive power, and he's got these incredible claws, and he's got these sharp teeth, and this incredibly strong bite that he can just rip into animals and hold on to animals there. And you've got the king of the jungle on the one side, and yet you've got the water buffalo on the other side, and it's just amazing. He doesn't have claws. He doesn't have teeth. He's a big thing, he's strong, but when you compare him to the lion, it's totally different. What gives him a chance of surviving against the king of the jungle? It's his horns. It's his horns that give him some power and his strength. When you think about horns, there's 2 aspects that give horns, that make horns a big deal. Horns are something of power, and horns are something of pride
or glory. When bucks fight, they use their racks, their antlers. When a cow has a set of horns, you respect that cow, because if you don't, you're going to get hurt far worse than otherwise. God is working with the children of Israel. They're an agricultural, by and large, agricultural nation here, and he uses something that was brought out throughout much of the Old Testament, the concept of horns. And horns picture that matter of power, and yet with them is a glory and a splendor. The bigger the set of horns, the greater the trophy. There's a pride with them. There's a power with them. It was the first day of hunting season in 2016, and Stephen Tucker took aim at a whitetail buck with a coveted rack. He had never seen anything like it. Unfortunately, his muzzleloader gun did not fire well, and the deer took off. Not to be discouraged, 2 days later, he was out hunting again and saw this same trophy buck on Tennessee farmland, which was a rarity, they say. Normally, some of the bigger ones are more in the Midwest. The white-tailed deer's antlers had an amazing 47 points. Normally, you think of 8 or 10 or 12 or something like that. It had 47 points. They have a special process that judges go through a few months later after the rack has dried out, and they do all these calculations and measurements, and they give it a score, and his 47-point rack earned a total score of 312 and 3/8, and is the largest rack of a hunted deer. They were asking him about his antlers, and he said, well, they're in a very safe place. He said they're not even on display. There's a certain pride about this. He's going to keep track of these. He's going to keep them in a special place so that they don't get broken. One of the points get knocked off or something like that. When we think of horns, we think of power, we think of pride. And here in this particular vision, Zechariah has a vision of horns. It's not a vision that necessarily right off the page speaks to us, but when we understand some of these things, we can begin to appreciate what is brought out in these verses. And I want to walk through it in 3 steps here tonight to look at these 4 verses on this vision, and I want you to see a couple truths. The first truth that I want you to notice is that Zechariah could see the opposition. We see the opposition. And here we find in verse number 18, then lifted I up mine eyes and saw, and behold, 4 horns. And I said unto the angel that talked with me, what be these? And he answered me, these are the horns which have scattered Judah, Israel, and Jerusalem. Remember, on the night of this vision, these 8 visions here, it had been exactly 5 months since the children of Israel had begun to rebuild their temple here. And all of a sudden, Zechariah has this vision. I picture a black background. I don't know how you'd picture this vision. And as he looks at this black background, all of a sudden he sees 4 horns. I don't know what kind of horns they were. Maybe they were longhorn, or maybe they were bison, or maybe they were bighorn sheep, or maybe they were pronghorn. It doesn't tell us. It doesn't matter what they were. They may have been attached to an animal, because later on he's going to talk about this animal's response, but we're not even told that they're necessarily attached to an animal. But he sees these particular horns here, and he doesn't know what they are. What's the meaning of them? And so he asks the angel, and as we've discussed before, I believe that this angel is the angel of the Lord. It is Jesus Christ himself, and Jesus gives him the answer that these horns are the 4 powers that have scattered God's people. And he describes God's people in an interesting way. He calls them Judah, Israel, and Jerusalem, and that's kind of an all-encompassing way to talk about God's people. The northern kingdom was Israel. The southern kingdom was Judah. Their capital city was Jerusalem. And he's talking about all of the horns that have scattered God's people, that have brought damage to them. You know, it's a difficult time when someone moves, isn't it? You think about, I don't know if you knew somebody when you were a kid. I remember when I was a kid and families involved in our church and whatnot and would move to another state or something. It's a challenging thing because there's that scattering that's there. There's a diminishing of the friendship many times. Kids graduate from high school and they're all the best of friends, and then they scatter to do the different things and go to college and get married and do these things, and sometimes it's decades before they're all back together again, if ever. Scattering is a challenging thing, but when it comes to war, the scattering is that much more challenging and that much more difficult here. as an army comes in, and some are killed, and some are hauled in this direction, and some are sold in slaves as this direction, and some are abused and taken in this direction. And many times, through the ravages of war, they're never brought back together again. They're never able to come back together again. And Israel had experienced that. They have been scattered through the ravages of war. And he said, these are the four powers, the four horns that have done this. And Bible students are all curious, who's exactly referring to? When you look at the verse and it says, these are the horns which have scattered Judah, if it's past tense, then you'd have to come up with probably four kingdoms that have already done this. And you might think of, Egypt in the past, and you might think of Assyria and Babylon, and Medo-Persia is the current kingdom by this time. So it could be those four kingdoms. Other people think, Zechariah was written, this event took place in 520 BC. The book of Daniel only took place about 10 years earlier, was finished up about 530 BC. And Daniel refers to four kingdoms. He refers to Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome. And so maybe there's a little bit of a reference to those four particular kingdoms. Other Bible students say, the four kingdoms, the four horns here, just referred to the four corners of the globe, the 4 points of the compass. And it just refers to every single enemy of God's people throughout time, across the world. And perhaps there's a little bit of sense in which all of those are true. If it's general, then it's referring to all of them. If it's specific, it's referring to specific kingdoms. It's referring to those who have been the opposition of God's people. And Zechariah saw that opposition. He saw the horns. And to be honest, as we have looked in these last several weeks and beginning our study of Zechariah, we have noticed that these people have seen the opposition. If you want to do background reading on it, you can read Ezra chapter 4, 5, and 6. And Ezra recounts much of the opposition that those people faced. They saw the opposition. They saw the horns pushing against them. They saw the difficulties that they were facing in that time. And he starts the vision, that's where they're at. That's where many times we are at. And in life, many times as we try to serve God, we see the horns, don't we? We see the opposition that's there. We can see the working of Satan, and we can see how he's manipulating and twisting things around and so nastily working behind the scene in his long war against God. And sometimes we can see a political party that we disagree with, and we feel like they're the opposition and they're going against God. And sometimes we can see certain movements in our country, and these movements are anti-God and pushing against what is right and what is righteous and what is God-honoring. And we can see that. And we can see certain religions at times, and these religions around the world are just absolutely opposed to God, and sometimes will even name the name of God, but on the other hand, they're pushing against God here. Sometimes you can see governments, world powers. Sometimes they're at personal levels. As we are trying to do what's right and we receive some sort of opposition against us as we're trying to serve God with our lives. And that opposition can be challenging. We see it, we notice it. I got a Christian newspaper in the mail yesterday, and I was just flipping through it a little bit and noticing it. I think some of the interesting things in this, in addition to sermons and whatnot, are the news tidbits. And I was amazed how many news tidbits were in here. And I just want to read you some of the titles. First one in here says, California churches still fighting shutdown. And it talks about how Gavin Newsom out there is still trying to keep all the churches shut down, and people are still struggling with that. Huffington Post blaming Christian school curriculums for Capitol riots. Another one, university professor says heterosexuality is, quote, tragic, is another one that's there. A few pages over, it talks about pro-life groups warns that ERA, which is the Equal Rights Amendment, is used as a stealth missile to insert abortion rights into the Constitution. Another one, woke companies try to smother MyPillow. Haters target conservatives and Christians. Let's see, Tennessee Governor Bill Lee tells Vice President Harris, you're wrong, abortion isn't health care. 3 more pro-abortion extremists in key policy positions. $1.6 billion of tax dollars to promote the abortion agenda in 2016 to 2018. And just so many of these are just amazing. Sonia Sotomayor objects to the death penalty for convicted murderers but approves killing innocent babies. Biden and Harris commit to enshrine Roe v. Wade in federal law. Roe v. Wade has allowed 62 million babies to die in abortion since 1973. Lockdowns, churches, and the alarming suicide rate. Penalties, purges ahead for military personnel since Biden kept his promise to the radical LGBT lobby and signed his executive order. Democrat Tulsi Gabbard warns about domestic terrorists in her own party, and on and on and on since I put you asleep. I was a little amazed as I read the articles and looked through the paper just how many article after article after article after article were all articles in which you just felt the opposition. You could just see the opposition. You just see over and over and over again so many forces at work in our world pushing against what is right. And I don't know about you, but there are times in which you really see the opposition. You feel the opposition as you're trying to do what is right. And Zechariah saw the opposition. Elizabeth Elliot tells about she was training to be a missionary, and she went to New York City with another lady that was training, and they wanted to learn Spanish. And so a church gave them opportunity to stay evidently in one of their housing accommodations, as it were. I think to them it was free, though it was worth the grand total of $17 a month in New York City. I don't know, of course, back in that day and time how that would rank, but I'm guessing from her further description that it wasn't a quality establishment. She said the heat was on in their apartment for a couple hours a day, and you never knew which hours those would be. They did have hot water from 6 a.m. to 7 a.m. every single morning. They lived right next to a brewery, and so all the time they were constantly smelling beer, and they listened to the noise of trucks coming and going all day and all night. She didn't say that it was connected to that, though I would wonder. She said there were rats, large black rats, big enough to dump over the garbage can that was in the kitchen. And she describes what life was like in New York City. They were the only people, really, probably the only ones in their entire neighborhood that spoke English, and they were there to try to learn the Spanish that everybody else in the neighborhood was speaking. And as much as she said this was a challenge, she said this was nothing compared to when we went to Ecuador. All of this prepared us just to go to Ecuador. And she describes in her book these strange ashes, 4 major events that she experienced in the jungle as she was trying to serve God, trying to get things done to understand the local language, write it down, and get the Bible translated to these people. There was a woman that died in childbirth, and the missionaries had been connected to this woman, and she really felt like that was a setback in the eyes of the public, in that this woman died under their care. They weren't able to save her life. Another man was shot, and that was a challenge for them. Another time, she had all of her notes that she'd been working on learning their language, writing all these notes. She had them in a suitcase. She's traveling somewhere, and her suitcase got stolen. Days, weeks, maybe months' worth of work was gone. Her fiancé, of course, Jim Elliott, was working on the other side of the mountains, and he was trying to gather lumber for building these different missionary buildings, and he had 500 boards that he had planed down. She said that was equivalent to 500 days of labor out in the jungle. Flood came through and took them all downstream. They were gone. 500 days worth of labor was gone. And she just could see all of these things. And of course, she said, by and large, I never knew why God allowed those different things to happen in my life. And sometimes as you go through life, we're really good at seeing the opposition. We can see the horns. We can see the difficulties that we face. But that wasn't where they stopped. That wasn't where God stopped with the vision. Verse number 20 tells us the second thing. And the Lord showed me 4 carpenters. The second truth that I want you to notice tonight from this passage is that you have to not only see the opposition, but you have to see God's instruments. See God's instruments. This particular word carpenter, of course, the Old Testament was largely written in Hebrew, but the Greek version of the Old Testament uses this word carpenter. It's the same word that's used in the New Testament for Jesus Christ. He was a carpenter. Same word used for his father. He was a carpenter. And it can describe not only someone who works with wood, but the word in the Hebrew can describe somebody who works with stone, somebody who works with metal, and so it can be the idea of a craftsman as well. And he looks and he sees these 4 horns, and then he sees these 4 craftsmen, these 4 carpenters. And when God's going to deal with these horns, God does not send 4 nurses. We love nurses. My mother's a nurse. But he doesn't send 4 nurses with that gentle, mild bedside manner. He sends 4 burly, manly, strong carpenters that know how to swing a hammer and drive in a chisel and know how to chop with an axe and cut with a saw. He sends some strong men to do the work in the picture here. And how many carpenters does he send in verse number 20? He sends 4. Why does he send 4? Because there's 4 horns. And the Lord wanted Zechariah to see a second thing, a set of 4 craftsmen who were going to handle these horns. Earlier in chapter number 1, back in verse 8, he sees these riders on horses. He sees these horses. And God is going to use horses to accomplish his task. And now, the Lord of hosts, a phrase that is used so many times here, the Lord of armies, not only can use horsemen and horses, but now he's going to use carpenters. Because God always has his laborers, his vindicators, his executioners ready. For every evil power, the Lord of armies has provided a counteracting power that is more than adequate to destroy it. And we have to see God's instruments. God has an instrument to deal with these horns. And that instrument, there are enough of them. They match, they fit, they can handle it, they're strong enough. For Jonah, God's instrument was a great fish. For Pharaoh, God's instrument was a shepherd named Moses. For Samson, God's instrument was Delilah. For farmers in Joel's day, it was a bug called locusts or grasshoppers. For Herod of Acts chapter 12, God used worms. For Israel, God used the Babylonians. And for the Babylonians, God used the Persians. God always has his instrument, his exact, precise, perfectly ready instrument to handle the punishment that he needs to bring. And there are times in which we're concerned about the opposition and we're concerned about those that are going to fight righteousness and stand against what is God honoring here. Just rest in the fact that God has his instrument to deal with that person. You might not know what it is. You might not ever realize that it could possibly be that person, that situation, that nation, and yet God is an expert at bringing out instruments from the most unusual places, whether it be the depths of the sea or a worm eating a gourd or whatever it is. God can bring his instruments. And you have to rest in that. See the opposition. We're good at that. But see that God has his instruments. And that brings us to the last truth in verse 21. You have to see God's punishment. See the opposition, see God's instrument, see God's punishment. Verse 21, then said I, what come these to do? And he spake, saying, these are the horns which have scattered Judah, so that no man did lift up his head. But these, talking about the carpenters, are come to fray them, to cast out the horns of the Gentiles, which lifted up their horn over the land of Judah, to scatter it. He tells us a little bit more about these horns here in verse 21. He tells us that their scattering was so intense that no man did lift up his head. They so crushed the Jewish people, they so attacked them that no man could be lifted up. They were driven into the ground, they were humbled, they were debased in that way here. They had rather severely defeated and depressed God's people. And he tells us also at the end of verse number 21, they had lifted up their horn. Lifting it up in pride, lifting it up and showing off their strength in that regard here. They had scattered it. They had so defeated them that no one could lift up their head, but they had lifted up their horn to scatter them. And God had an appropriate punishment for them. 2 punishments are brought out here. The first one is, they are come to fray them. The word fray is an interesting thing. I was kind of thinking what worn out blue jeans had to do with this passage here. Frayed jeans is what I was thinking, or something like that. But that's a different word, different concept here. The word fray, we think of as an old term that maybe we don't use anymore, and yet you use it all the time when you say you are afraid. The word means to be fearful. It means to be terrified. That's what the concept was here. Isn't it interesting that God sends 4 carpenters, craftsmen, to terrify these horns? These horns that have all this power, these horns that have all this strength, these horns that have all this glory and pride, and they're so strong and they're so mighty, and they're going to do so many things against God and against God's people. God sends 4 carpenters to terrify the horns. And that's a pretty encouraging thing, isn't it? Remember Belshazzar, the king, in Daniel chapter 5? When he saw the handwriting on the wall, this arrogant, blasphemous, drunken king was greatly troubled when he saw the handwriting on the wall. He was afraid. Do you remember Herod the Great, that wicked and awful king, when Jesus was born and the wise men came into Jerusalem and they said, "Where is he that is born, King of the Jews?" And when Herod heard these things, he was troubled. There's some alarm, there's some fear, there's some terror there. How about the Roman soldiers when Jesus Christ was in the tomb and the angel came down from heaven and was bright and shining and rolled away the stone? The Bible tells us that those mighty Roman soldiers, these powerful, battle-hardened men, for fear of him, they did shake and became as dead men. Their great power turned to fear. Or how about Daniel chapter number 4, the world power Nebuchadnezzar and all of his glory and all of his splendor? Is not this the mighty Babylon that I have built? And yet he has a dream. And in Daniel 4 and verse number 5, his dream terrifies him. You know what? It's an encouraging thing to us to see that part of God's punishment is that they're terrified. When some big, bully, dominating, harmful enemy gets scared, we rejoice. And these 4 carpenters would make every horn afraid. Fear and terror would be upon them. Fear and terror were the common companions of a city or kingdom being conquered. A man would be afraid for his family. Fear of a woman, of what would happen to her, the fear of children for slavery. All of this fear was real, and now the horns themselves would experience that fear. And quite often, we see that that was the case if it's referring to those kingdoms. For the Assyrian kingdom, if you want to read about what happened to them, the Babylonians came along and took them out, and you can read about it in the book of Nahum. What happened to the mighty Babylonians? The Medo-Persians came along and took them over. And no doubt they experienced the same fear and terror that they showed to others. And so there was a terrifying of them. And then it also says here in verse number 21, to fray them and to cast out the horns of the Gentiles. Cast them out, throw them out, cast them down. In other words, they're no longer going to be in power. They're going to be destroyed. They're going to be brought down. And there's an interesting thing to consider here. Was this describing in what was going to happen in that day and time? Well, if so, you can remember that we looked back at chapter number 1 and verse number 11. It talked about all the earth sits still and is at rest. Darius had come to the kingdom, and all of these kings had rebelled against him, and yet Darius had gone out and had victory over them, and he carved his memento up into that massive rock billboard that you can still see over in that part of the world today here. There was a sense in which Darius had gone out and had conquered different ones. The Medo-Persians and these different ones had conquered. And yet if it's a picture of the end of time, there will be a day and time in which God ultimately conquers and punishes all the nations that have fought against Israel. And he will rule and reign with a rod of iron, giving Israel finally the land that he has promised to them for many centuries and thousands of years before. And so God's punishment that he gives is the perfect punishment. They're terrified. And they're thrown down, cast out, and destroyed. And God will do it. It's a fitting punishment. It's fitting for them who have done so much damage to others. And so like all of us, Zechariah saw the horns of life, the powers and the forces that sinfully want to stop us and harm us and keep that which is righteous and godly from going forward. And we see that, and it bothers us. And they saw it and bothered them. But we have to see God's instruments, that God has an instrument in his time, in his way, with the perfect instrument. He will take care of those powers. And he will bring punishment. There's one more passage that I want you to see as we conclude. Go to the book of Revelation. Would you take a minute to turn there? Revelation chapter 5. These mighty horns, these mighty powers that had done so much against the children of Israel. In Revelation chapter 5, we have God's people standing around the throne, praising him, and all of that goes into chapter 4 and whatnot. But in Revelation chapter 5 and verse number 6, and I beheld, and lo, in the midst of the throne and of the 4 beasts and in the midst of the elders stood a lamb as it had been slain, having 7 horns and 7 eyes, which are the 7 spirits of God sent forth into all the earth. When John has his vision of Jesus Christ and he sees Jesus, the Lamb of God, he sees that Jesus has 7 horns. And what the symbolism there is that Jesus has all the power. All of the glory and the pride that goes with being the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, Jesus has it. And when there's all these horns pushing at us in opposition and fighting against God, just understand that the Lamb is still on the throne and He has all the power. All authority and power is given unto Him in heaven and in earth. And may it be an encouragement to us to see the vision of Zechariah and understand that God does judge. He will take care of those who oppose what is righteous in His time. Father, I do thank You for the opportunity to gaze at this vision and to be reminded of this truth in all of the opposition that we faced, especially in these days. And so, Lord, help us to keep our eyes upon You and our confidence in You. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Let's take out our prayer sheets here and take some prayer requests here tonight. I want to take several of these different prayer